Hello, Eileen. Nice to talk to you for a change on the on record, shall we say, about your life and your beliefs and so on. Just tell us very briefly about your ancestors and how you were brought up, and say something particularly about the kind of philosophy behind the culture you were being brought up in.
Oh yeah. Well, I was brought up in a Yorkshire mill village, just off the Pennines between Lancashire and Yorkshire. In Yorkshire, and I'm very proud of being a Yorkshire woman. And it was a mill village I lived in. There were two mills, and my father was the wool buyer at one mill. So I had two influences in my life. The mill, with the woolen industry, and the Baptist chapel, because my family were very religious. And my father was a deacon. My mother had been an Anglican, so we were baptised, but she then followed her husband dutifully and went to the Baptist chapel every Sunday. And it's very difficult these days to realise how important religion was. You talk about a philosophy. I had a religion from morning till night on Sunday. I went 4 times to chapel or Sunday school, and our lives revolved around the chapel, the seasons, the harvest festival, picnics in the summer, Easter, new clothes, etc. So I don't think I was religious in the way that I thought much about God, though I did teach in Sunday school, believe it or not, to the age of 21. I think more than anything, I expressed my feeling of otherness, of spirituality, if you like, through nature, because it was a wild countryside, very wild. And outside the village, there was a hill that led over to Bronte country. I was only 5 miles from where the Brontes were born, that harsh moorland. And I think that made me very tough and gave me, I always remember the word fortitude. I read a book called Fortitude, and that was what I wanted to aim for, to be strong. Whether that's a philosophy, but I was imbued with nature. I was only happy on the moors, picnicking or walking, and they were very wild.
And your name, Clough, your name means the valley, doesn't it?
Clough is, yes, it's a cleft in the hills. Cleft, it may be the word cleft, and like a coombe in Devonshire. There was the Clough in the village, and we'd come from the hills. My ancestors had been farmers and weavers in the cottages. And then they come down in the valley when they started the mills. And we played in the Clough. It was this beck that ran down the hillside.
So
part
then
of our life.
You won a scholarship. Am I right in thinking you were the first girl in your village to get educated at the local high school?
Well, it wasn't local really, because I had to walk a mile to the station, 5 miles on the train, mile at the other end. So I walked 4 miles a day for 11 years to that school in Skipton. There were 2 schools. One was in Keighley, 5 miles the other way from the village, and Skipton was a bit posher. It was agricultural. It was more, yes, Keighley was an industrial town, and I think my mother really wanted me to be a bit more genteel than with the hoi polloi of Keighley. I'm sure that was in her mind.
And what was Skipton like, the school, Skipton High School?
I went to Skipton High School. I went at the age of 7 to a kindergarten. My mother got me away from the village school. I think she was a great influence on my education, because she was an early feminist, really. She didn't join any movement, but she was determined I should have a good education. I don't think my father would have worried much. And I went to Skipton School and loved the whole 11 years. I went at the age of 7. I left at the age of 18 and I was head girl. And we had wonderful teachers because they had to be unmarried if they got married out. So there were all these, you see, there was no media, there was nowhere for clever girls to go. So they went to teaching and we benefited. Had a wonderful history teacher. Latin I took to because we had again a very, very clever woman who taught her. And I look back on my school days with great pleasure, much greater pleasure than when I went to London University to a women's college. I didn't get half the encouragement and the inspiration from my university teachers that I did from my school teachers, which is interesting.
And in those days, what were the exams called that you had to sit at secondary school?
Oh, well, we did matriculation, and that got you didn't need to do higher certificate. You could do a matriculation. At 16, it had to have Latin. If you didn't have a pass in Latin, you couldn't go to university.
So at 16 you sat an exam that then...
That was the matriculation which got you to university if you wanted. But I stayed on another 3 years and I got a state scholarship and a county scholarship. But in those days they were means tested and my father earned enough money, so he still had to pay for me because it was the time of the Depression, the first big depression that we're talking about now.
I was going to ask about the dates of all this. When were you actually born? And when
I was
did you go
born
to school?
in 1914, and there's a picture of me waving a flag when the First World War ended.
Do you remember that? Do you remember the end of the First World War?
Not really.
When are your very earliest memories then?
Oh, I don't remember my earliest memories. I think I remember being in an organdy frock, an organdy hat, sitting in a field and sitting on a cow clap, if you know what that was, and getting my beautiful organdy dress all soiled.
So being in nature again?
That was one of my earliest memories.
So then you went to London University to go back. What year did you go to the University of London?
I went to university. I graduated in 35, so I went in 32. I was there 3 years.
Right. And that was Bedford College, was it?
That was Bedford College for Women, which was in Regent's Park, and which has now been amalgamated with Holloway.
And did you like London? I mean, you've never lived in London before.
I loved London. I loved the theatre and concerts, and that was the part I remember. Otherwise, it was not very inspiring. I was very lonely. I wept a lot, strangely enough. I played the piano a lot to get rid of my emotions, and I'd play at the weekend. I never met the kind of people I ought to have met who were very intellectual. There was no one who really gave me a spark. It's funny thinking it over. It was very cliquey because, remember, university education wasn't free for all. It was only rich people who could afford to pay, plus a few scholarship people. So there were lots of rather posh girls. I had a Yorkshire accent. I wanted to get into the play the first year. I wasn't accepted because of my accent, which made me feel a bit humble and miserable. It was very, very cliquey. And they were all people with cars, girls with cars, and you know, they were socialites.
And I did just after the Roaring Twenties, I suppose. We're talking
yes, we're talking about that. They weren't my type, and yet one of them, in the end,
Peggy?
became one of my friends. But she was very radical. She was different. She was changed by her degree. I did French, and she did sociology, which is very interesting and opened up a lot of avenues.
Is that Peggy Curran you're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah. So for your degree, your French degree, you spent some time in France, did you?
Yes, that was the highlight really of that 3 years at university. That I went across to France a lot because we didn't get a year abroad then. So I used to go as an au pair. I went across the Channel. I went to Chantilly near Paris, and I made friends with particularly one aunt of some of the children I was teaching, and she became a lifetime influence on me. She was a very erudite woman, and she'd arranged that her nieces and nephews should get English lessons. That was me.
What was her name?
Mademoiselle Claire Frère.
Right. And that was in Chantilly, was it?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. Okay, and then you travelled around the world. Tell us a
Well,
bit
then
about
I did this course as secretarial, and I travelled for 2 years, and this friend came with me from university. She decided she'd like to come, and we worked our way round like people do today, only in my day they didn't do it in the same way. Very few people did. And at one stage in Australia, we started in Melbourne, we went on to Sydney, we hitchhiked up to the Barrier Reef, and then I went on to New Zealand, and she went on to America. And I then had to save money to get me home via South Africa, where I stayed another year.
So you had an uncle in South Africa, is that right?
Yes,
was that
and
Cape
I
Town,
stayed in Cape Town.
Right. And then when you were in South Africa was pretty much when the war was coming.
The war was coming, and he said, there's a war coming, because he was the leading banker actually in South Africa, and he was in touch with the Germans, the British, all the bankers in Europe, and he knew war was coming. He said, there's a war coming, and you've got to decide whether you're going to be on this side or go home, and I'll tell you you're going home. So get your passage booked and be off as quickly as you can. So I arrived in Britain, I think it was about 4 weeks before war was declared.
And what was the ship you came back on? Because
I've no idea.
You can't remember.
There were mail ships all the time.
Right.
Going backwards and forwards, I've forgotten.
It was one of the sailing ship type of things.
Oh
was
God,
it a steam
I'm
ship?
not so old, Tom.
Okay, fine. Okay. And
Was a liner, they called them.
oh right.
I remember the one I went to Australia on. It was called the Esperance Bay. What better?
So back in Britain at the start of the war, what did you do? What
Yes, well, first I was ill for a year. With the result of all my travelling, I got jaundice, then I got shingles, so I was out of action. Then I got a job locally in Yorkshire with the wool control, but I soon tired of that. And I met my first Marxist in Ilkley. He was a young economist, an Irishman, and he introduced me to left-wing thinking. I'd come across it a bit in South Africa. I'd met a Marxist on the boat who'd lent me Left Book Club editions, and the chap I met in Ilkley, because the wool control was in Ilkley, on Ilkley Moor, in a big hotel that they'd taken over. And he introduced me to the Left Book Club groups. There was a group in Ilkley, so we met, we discussed political ideas. And that made me restless, I think. And it made me feel I wanted something different than Ilkley Moor. And I answered an advert for a job with ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries, in Manchester. And I got the job as secretary to the marketing manager. And I worked there for about a year and a half as a personnel officer. Because by then, after leaving Ilkley, I decided I wanted to do a training for something, and I wanted to become personnel manager. I wanted to do something really involving the war industry. So I went to Edinburgh, and I got a place on a course.
Like a master's degree?
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, do. So this is about, I'll ask the question, and then if you reply, tell us when you're ready. Why don't you have the whiskey like in your lap? Wouldn't that
Well,
be
if
helpful?
you don't mind.
No, have it in your lap, and then you can
Sip it.
knock it back.
But that'll come up on the thing.
Well, so what? You know, I mean,
Right.
you're entitled to it. You've earned it.
It'll be like the chap who was drinking when he was dying.
Well, it's Dad's army, isn't it? You know, the old memories. No, you're entitled to it.
Could be anything, couldn't it?
It's lemon juice,
Yeah.
apple juice.
Apple
Yeah.
juice.
Yeah,
All right, I'm ready.
Okay.
yeah,
But stop
That's
again
fine.
when
Okay.
I want. It helps me.
fine. So tell us more about your engagement with Marxism and how Manchester helped that.
Oh yes, well, as I say, I was all ready for it because I'd never heard of the Daily Worker. I'd never read any communist thing, but I had in New Zealand. It was a gradual thing, you know. You don't suddenly change. It's a long process, and suddenly then there is a change, and that I think happened with me. When I got to Manchester, I was it was very bad, the factory conditions, but then I'm going too quickly. I've just got my training as personnel manager, and first of all, because I came back to the Imperial Chemicals later, but I went into Risley, which is now a prison, I'm afraid, and strangely enough I write to a prisoner there, and I've told him I once used to go round all those green lanes and things at Risley at night with a torch, and the searchlights would be overhead because it was a filling factory, and if they'd hit us, the whole thing would have blown up with all of us. So I worked in this filling factory.
Filling shells, are you talking about?
Filling shells.
Oh.
And I would go around on the night shift, and you'd talk to the old ladies, the old ladies of 74, painting shells, feeling sick. And on the day shift, you'd cope with managers, foremen who were bullying the women, and the women would come in tears. You were there to smooth things out. I remember one night I had to empty my purse. There were two angry Irish labourers who hadn't been paid. So what I did, I wouldn't do it now, but I emptied my purse, I shared the money with them, said, give it me tomorrow when you get paid. So, you know, that kind of thing. We were solving little problems, and the management was pretty bad. There were about 80,000 workers on 3 shifts, and about 8 different, you know, there was one where they filled detonators, the young girls, another shell filling, the bomb factory. And every night the bomb factory would say how many bombs they'd filled at the end of the shift. And the next shift would try to beat them. And it was just at the time that the Russian troops, the Soviet troops, were fighting the Germans, who were advancing in the end almost to Moscow. So we were helping the war effort. And wherever you looked, Mrs. Churchill was knitting socks for the war effort. We were having sales of work. When I'd been at my study course in Edinburgh, we were all busy knitting in between the courses. So there was a great feeling of sympathy because we knew the Russians were fighting. If Hitler had turned on us, well, we would have been overwhelmed.
Uh-huh.
So I worked there for about 2 years. And then for various personal reasons, which I won't go into, I left, and I wanted me back as a personnel person. And that's where I met a lot of people again who were in the Communist Party. I came to the Communist Party in a way through the trade unions, and I've always been a great supporter of trade unions. And I looked after the material factory. There were a lot of labs. I'd go around the labs perhaps every day or twice a week, see what complaints there were, and I'd go through the factory. And it was dreadful. It was like Engels' stories of Manchester in the 19th century. These sheds, they were dying, developing aniline dyes. The indigo shed, for instance, it was dilapidated, it was creaky, it was wet, it was open to the air, there was some kind of a roof. And the men got impregnated with blue. Their wives would say even the knife handles were blue at home. The conditions were bad.
And cancer was...
they got cancer, and the management, they fought the, what do you call it?
The regulation.
The insurance companies. It was a fight between this strong management and the insurance to get to get the money for the workers who had gone down with this carcinoma.
So you were seeing, in effect, the cutting edge of class struggle, if you will.
I saw it very deeply, and
yet you yourself had come from, let's say, a middle class background.
I'd come from I was
so it was a
high
shock.
up in the hierarchy at home in the village. The workers in the mill were my aunts. My aunts were weavers. The friends in chapel worked in the mill. They were very quiet. The mill was a light, very modern building. There was a dam outside where the swans... We never got the feeling that there was a lot of exploitation. I didn't learn that. I remember the general strike, in the village. My father was a special constable on the side, not of the workers, of course. But that passed me over. I thought, oh dear.
So it was Manchester that you saw the actual...
It was Manchester that did it with all the meetings I went to, because Manchester was very also tied in with India, the exploitation of India, because...
Gandhi had come, hadn't he?
Yes, there was all the crowd, the people clamouring for freedom in India, and the Gandhi thing. And we used to have meetings because they had to get the cotton workers on their side. The Indians were saying, you take our raw materials and then you develop them with manufacture. We want to manufacture our own. And it was exploitation, of course, of these colonial countries that were part of our bailiwick, as it were.
You talked before, we were discussing about Churchill and the ambiguity of his response to the invasion of the Soviet Union. Tell us about that.
I'm trying to...
In June 1941, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union.
Oh yes, well
do you remember
I was
what
then...
you were doing at the time?
I do very clearly. If there's anything I remember, it's that. he was going to speak. In the morning we heard that Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union. Now, in Britain, there was a great gap in the political spectrum because the Tories, many of them, not all, but a great group of them, were appeasers and had been hobnobbing with the Germans. Ribbentrop had been coming over to Cliveden, and there was what was known as a Cliveden set, pro-German. And the book's been written about this, an amazing feeling amongst the politicians of, we've got to get together with the Germans, because in the end we're going to have to fight Bolshevism. Now, when in the morning the announcement came over the air that Germany had invaded the Soviet Union, a few of us from the Communist Party agreed to meet in the afternoon and listen to Churchill. And it always amazes people when I tell them that that day, and it is as true as I'm talking to you, we did not know which side he'd come down. And we listened to him with bated breath. And so I was always a great Churchill fan for that only, because he said quite categorically, he saw the fascists as the enemy. And he said, we will fight with our comrades, he called them comrades. I think if you read his speech, we will join with them and fight with them. And then, of course, the Communist Party, which till then had been very reluctant to do anything for the war, because they felt it was like it was about Lebensraum. It was about territory. Hitler wanted territory. We, other nations, wanted to keep their territory. So, rightly or wrongly, the Communist Party wouldn't have anything to do with the war, as it was before the Russians entered. And the Daily Worker was banned. There was a great feeling against the communists. And it's, again, as I said to you earlier, in about 200 years, we'll get the real feel of what happened and how it happened. But
because German communists, of course, were being persecuted by Hitler.
Oh, they were the
Already
first. The
rounded
first
up
to go, they'd all gone, and the trade unions. Yes.
in the concentration
So
camps.
the Communist Party saw it then on as a class struggle. And, you know, looking back, it's amazing. I suppose it's because of that we felt it was a people's war. And certainly from the point of view, I'm saying, of the communists, not of the ordinary people, because they were very supportive too of dear old benign Uncle Joe, as we called him. It's rather sardonic. But
So how did you think of Stalin? I mean, you obviously didn't know about
well,
Gulag,
we
did you?
saw him as a great friend. He was a great tactician militarily. He had good. We realised that the people of Russia were fighting our battle. They lost millions in the war, and how many was it? 26 million now. Now, when I was teaching later on this part of history, I'd say to my pupils, I think the British lost about 500,000, the British and American together. The Russians lost 23 million, and we forget that. When I asked the kids in the class, who do you think lost the most men? It was always Britain. They never knew the role of the Soviet Union. And I think that this has not got to be forgotten.
No, that's important to remember that history. And then later on you moved to London, didn't you? And lived with Libby. Tell us how that happened and who Libby was.
Well, I just got a job offered. I met some friends of friends who came up to Manchester to a conference. I think I put one of them up. The boss was amongst them, got back to London, Eileen, I would like to give you a job. And I went down to, it was just at the end, towards the end of the war, when not the V-bombs, the V2s, the things that cut off and went.
The doodlebugs.
The beginning of the missile things. So, of course, by then I was very pleased to go. I'd been at ICI, I'd done my bit there. And I came down to London. And it was a different kind of job, because I was in the personnel department. And they had 20 factories. And we were setting policy. It was a policy.
Was that metal box?
Yes.
Yeah.
The metal box. And
so it was more strategic.
there were 5 women and 1 man in charge. And he'd worked in Liverpool in an aircraft factory. And he used to tell us how the management couldn't move without the unions, because the strength of the unions and the strength of the productivity committee. Because it was a very different climate in a factory those days. There were safety committees. There were all kinds of committees run jointly by management and workers. Joint productivity committees, when workers were consulted, were there better ways of doing this, which of course they're a mine of information, and it was all used. Today there's nothing like that.
And then later, during that period in London, you met your future husband, didn't you?
Well, he always said he met me in a lift. Yes.
And then you moved to travel to North America to look at productivity and factory conditions.
That was, yes.
After the war.
After the war.
Tell us how that happened and what.
Well, it happened because the minute the war was over, they jolly well knew I was very radical at Metal Box, and I had flu very badly. And so they just gave me my cards, gave me my P45, and said thank you. And I think I got about 3 months' salary. And the others had gone, because in that group of us, there were 2 of us in the Communist Party, and they knew. And the others were very radical, even the boss. It was a different ethos altogether. It was a very dedicated, moral ethos. And we were doing wonderful policies for disabled people, because we expected so many disabled who never materialised. We were doing hiring policies,
for the company
for the companies in the factories. And I used to go down to see some of the factories, and they were rather like the ones I've seen in Manchester. They won't be now, they've all been demolished and new ones built. But at the end of the war, yes, I took my G-mob money, the money I'd got, and went to America. I went via Canada on a little, not a trawler, what do you call them? A small...
A merchant ship.
Merchant ship, a very small one, which carried 6 passengers. My husband crossed on the Queen Mary or something. He wasn't my husband then. Met me in New York. And then we spent... I was an immigrant, believe it or not. And I got this famous green card which lets you work. So I could work. He didn't get a green card. He wasn't an immigrant. And so I had to work. We stayed in Philadelphia with his brother. And we were in America, to cut it very short, at the time of the McCarthy period. The first weekend we got there, we went to Independence Square, which was the historic square where they signed the Act of Independence from Britain. And there was a great rally because in Hollywood they'd indicted, I think the Hollywood 10, that was it. They'd put them in jail for being communists, and there was a whole movement to support them. And one of the speakers, I remember, he was pelted with tomatoes, but the tomatoes had stones in them, so he had a gash in his cheek with blood. It was a dreadful thing, and we realized we were absolutely horrified, because the America we knew was the America of Roosevelt. We adored Roosevelt, you know.
Mm.
And I soon realized when I went around the factories in America and talked to management how much they hated Roosevelt, some of those
The management
captains of
people.
industry,
Yeah.
because we were fated, because we had very good credentials from Britain, from the personnel department, organisation rather. And we were fated, we were eating in wonderful dinners, lunches in boardrooms. We were meeting top people because we were there to discover why American productivity was so high. And what we felt, was it better management? And this became my husband. I thought you turned it off.
I forgot.
It's not a... Let's get on a bit.
Sure, we're moving at the rate of knots here.
We're not.
So, you went to the Harvard Business School, that kind of place, talking
Oh
to
yes,
management
George, they
experts.
wanted George to do a degree there, but he hadn't any money. He wrote articles. I worked anywhere to make money. One time I'd be dining in a General Motors boardroom. Next I'd be selling nylons in the local department store. I sold nylons. I did all kinds of jobs. George sold, so did I, Encyclopedia Britannicas at the door. He sold them, I never did. He had great charm and could captivate all the women.
Did you like America? What was your feeling of the energy and enthusiasm of
Well, I
Sussex?
loved the American people, but it was a very bad time to be there because of the McCarthy. And because of my connections with the communist movement, I met communists. We went to Detroit, I worked there, and I worked in Chicago. And in Detroit, we met a trade unionist. He was in the tool room of General Motors, not Ford. And you see, they only had unions in those Detroit factories from about the first year of the war, or even just before. And they'd had to fight desperately to be allowed to be unionized. They'd had hoses sprayed. In the end, they sat on the roof of the factory. They took over the factory and wouldn't come out until they'd promised they could have the union. It had been a bitter fight. We have no idea of the strength and the power of that fight to get unions.
And you say they drew a circle around you?
Oh, and he in the tool room, that was the kind of thing that happened. He had a yellow circle round his machine in the tool room, saying, "Don't go near him, he's a communist." In the end, this is also very funny, in the end he came down here in a limousine sent by the Transport and General Workers Union, because he was head of the Retired Workers of America, the trade union, and he was decorated by Eisenhower. So in the end he got his comeuppance, which was a lovely story. Yeah. But we loved the American people. It was amazing when we went there, because we'd come, no bananas, no nylons, nothing. And here was this land of plenty. And they plied us with steaks and about 10 different flavours of ice cream. It was like being in a kind of semi-paradise at the beginning. And we did see a lot of the seedy side of America, because we'd no money. I arrived in Detroit and I knew I'd got to get a job the next day or we'd be in trouble. And George found me one, and I got it in an insurance company, but we were on a knife edge as far as money went. And so we travelled with poor people. We were travelling with on Greyhound, and today I think Greyhounds are perhaps more important. In those days they were, you know, the poor people travel. It's like the poor people travel on buses today. I come up and down on the bus here, and it's all the poor who are on it. You don't see many well-dressed people, though Brighton buses are quite good. Anyhow, we went length and breadth of America. We had to save money because we could only take $100, which
When you arrived in the country?
when we arrived in America. So we had to earn every penny. We were put up by George's brother in Philadelphia, but we studied and kept a diary, and eventually together wrote a book, which was never published. But we travelled right across.
And that book was on the Organisation of American Industry?
Yes, it was.
Right. And then you ended up moving to Canada, is that
Well, we went from America, we crossed America, and realised what a wonderful country it is. You know, visually, it's a marvellous country. And the ideals of America, you know, they still had this belief that everyone could become president. They had this great belief in their own country. They hadn't got it under Bush's time, but perhaps they'll find it again with Obama. They loved their country in a way that you've never seen Britons. I guess perhaps at the height of empire but I think there was a lot of disillusionment then. But I loved
well, patriotism is what you're saying.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's more than that. It's
Deep love.
belief, and it is a wonderful country. It's a bit the same feeling you get in France of loving their country. The French love their country in a way.
It's partly loving the land, isn't it? One of the
The
things
land,
in your book
yes,
that
and
you
the land
published
was
is about landscapes and how
lands.
important
Yes, it
they are. And
was.
these,
And
these
people
countries-
were open. That was the other thing, so open. You know, British people, I spent 5 years here till I really felt at home in Brighton. I invited people, I never got invited back. And coming from North America, it was Canada actually, but where the minute they meet you, oh, you must come and you must meet so-and-so. They're very outward, generous. But the black side to it, of course, was that wherever we went, they'd never heard a British accent. Now people go over all the time. We were about amongst the first to go over after the war, and we were looked on. We were thin, so we were looked on as heroes and heroine. We were feted, and the people in the shops and so on would say, "Do go on talking. Oh, what a wonderful accent." You know, we were strange bodies. It was very curious.
Did you go to California in
But
those days?
yes, we went the whole way up. But I wanted to say something. You spoilt my train of thought. What was I? I was going to say about the American people, very important. The end of the war, as soon as they knew we were British, the times we got this to us, "Why didn't you finish the Ruskies off? You were very stupid. You should have finished them off." That was the whole, you know, the whole tenor of what they said to us.
It was anti-Russian.
Anti-Russian, the anti-Bolshevists, they saw them as the enemy. And of course that was the seeds of the Cold War. And the atom bomb had been dropped.
But do you remember when the atom bomb was dropped?
It's a very funny thing. That's something my memory doesn't remember me where I was. But I remember.
You would have been in London.
I've written up in my book all the reactions to it in the newspapers, in the religious papers. It was very obvious then that this was a weapon of immeasurable good or terrible damage, terrible implications. You could wipe out civilization or you could make life better. Now the Catholic Herald said this, even the Daily Mail said this. And I've quoted the press in a chapter on my book, and that's very, very important.
Mm-hmm. Einstein was one of several scientists at that time
Yes,
who took up
he
the cause
was.
of, against nuclear weapons.
Yes, he did.
Do you remember, when did Einstein first come into your ken, as it were? Did you
Oh,
know
well,
of
we
him,
went to
or-
Princeton and saw his house.
Did you?
Yeah. Because he
Did you hear him lecture, or?
No, I never met him, but we all knew of his appeal to Roosevelt. We heard that there was a letter on his desk, on Roosevelt's desk, from him saying, I think if Roosevelt had lived, he wouldn't have dropped the bomb.
It was
As we were
Truman's,
saying, Truman
decision.
was just a hick politician.
So did you respect Einstein's peace activism?
Well,
at
of
that
course,
point?
of course.
Mm.
And that, I'm trying to think.
I mean, I remember a pamphlet you used to have called "Why I'm a Socialist" by Einstein. Do you remember?
Oh,
the
well,
context of
it's
that?
one of so many of them. I'm trying to think now where I am. We went to, we'd come, as Thomas asked me if I'd been to California. Well, we crossed to Los Angeles, saw the Grand Canyon on the way. And that gave me part of my philosophy of life, because the guide looked across. We were on the rim of one rim. It was almost half a mile across with the Colorado right down the river. And he looked across to the outer rim, the other rim, and he pointed, it was a mile down almost, down the canyon, pointed to the top little layer of soil, the centimetre. And he said, that represents the time humans have been on the earth. He would say man has been on the earth, but I say human. So that made me feel, well, we haven't grown out of barbarism yet. And I
So the
think
vast distance of evolution that
yes,
took to get
I
us
know,
to where
to
we
get
are.
there, isn't it? It
Yeah.
brought it home in a way.
Yeah.
Nothing else ever has. But then when we'd got to Los Angeles, we came right up the coast to San Francisco. George went on to Canada, and I stayed in San Francisco working in a store again, selling nylons or what have you. And I stayed with some relatives from Yorkshire, vague relatives, but I had a place to go. And then I joined him in Canada, and we came across Canada. And then I worked in a bookstore in Toronto. He worked in Apple Orchard, and we saved our fare home. And meantime, I was pregnant with Jane. She was born back in England. We stayed a year or so in England. Then George went back to Canada. He worked for the Labour government was in, the nationalised industries were in full swing, and he worked for the nationalised road hauliers. Now, even then he was finding problems, because they'd kept all the old managers who were just waiting for the day that nationalisation would be overturned, which it was. He saw it coming. And he came home one day. It doesn't say much for my feminism. He said, I've given my notice and we're going to Canada. And I was just a passive recipient of that.
And that was what, 1950, when you went
Yes,
back?
49, 50.
Yeah.
And he went back and got a job with the railways in Canada. And we stayed in Canada for 11 years. And that's where my youngest son, Thomas, who was interviewing me, was born. So he has dual nationality.
And
I took out a baby of 6 weeks, my elder son, and my daughter, who was a year and a bit. And we were met by George at Halifax on a cold midwinter day, so much below zero. And we stayed in Canada for 15 years, and during that time we all worked. We both worked for the peace movement. We used to have meetings in our house. There was something which I'd love to see happen in Britain. The Canadian Broadcasting Commission had something called Citizens Forum. And in all the cities across Canada, they would have an evening of people talking, and then they would leave it, they'd get views of other people, a bit like one of our symposiums here on the radio, or rather on the television, but they would then give out the edict on the last meeting. They'd say the views of the people. Say they talked about, I remember what, they were the same things we talk about today. Is the atom bomb, I don't know, is nuclear war inevitable, something like that. And then I would report from Montreal on the radio. Well, we thought this, and so on.
So you were interviewed on the radio?
Well, I just
Feedback
delivered,
from
yes, feedback.
Yeah.
And then in Minnesota, there'd be, rather in Winnipeg, they'd be feeding back, and so on.
Uh-huh.
And all the time we were there, we were the hub of this Citizens Forum. And it was the scientists I was very interested in, because people like Einstein, people like the one in France, Joliot-Curie, these scientists who were protesting about the atom bomb. Rotblat, who only died about a year ago now, I think it is, who's worked ever since he worked on the bomb, for peace, for realizing the potential that this awful bomb can do.
Uh-huh.
So we continued. I started my peace work really in Canada, and I worked a lot for something called Voice of Women. And then we came back to Brighton, and then there was a very strong, it was in the 50s, the Aldermaston March had started the year before, I think. The first year we were here, we took Thomas in a pram and the two kids, and we didn't go the whole way, but we went outside London and met them and walked back in the great Easter March.
1960 that was probably.
And I've been working ever since. Finally, I very soon got onto the executive committee of CND in Brighton, and I've worked with the peace movement in Brighton ever since.
Uh-huh. And in your time in Canada, one thing I want to talk about is you got involved with the Communist Party in Canada as well. Can you tell us how that happened? That was interesting.
Well, when I was going to Canada, one thing about the Communist Party, or I suppose any international organisation, as Thomas knows, you have friends all over the world. There was this strong feeling of solidarity. I worked with the French a lot. I did a great deal in Britain with the French, but you have this feeling of international. So that was how I got a contact with some communists in Detroit. Now, it was illegal, the Communist Party, obviously, but through this one contact I had, it was a sister of a Communist Party member here, Bob Stewart, who was on the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Great Britain, a lovely old Scot, very genial, and I had a lovely talk, and he wanted me to see his sister, who lived in Detroit. So that's how we had, and then they passed me on to a communist woman they knew in Chicago. So we were very fortunate in that we saw, there was no meetings, there was nothing like that. We just met them
like
socially.
a network, we call it.
And for instance, the one in Chicago took us, I remember we went to one amazing, on the south side, amazing jazz session with jazz musicians who had come up from the south. Absolutely fantastic. Well, you know, it was all part of the radical network. And so that was how I...
And somehow
and when
you moved to Montreal.
and then when I went through Canada, we met Tim Buck, who was the leader of the Communist Party. I think in Winnipeg at a social or something. Anyhow, we were only minor figures, but he was a very old head of the Communist Party of Canada. And then one day I was, I don't know how, probably from our contacts, I can't remember them now, but obviously someone had been told in Montreal to get in touch, and I was ill in bed one evening, and there was a ring at the bell, and George went, and it was a tall chap we'd never seen before, and he said, "Can I come in? I've come to greet you as communists." And he'd been sent to meet us and help us in Montreal and so on. Now, the Communist Party in Montreal was also illegal, as you know.
So this is all kind of clandestine.
It was. We did. I don't
contacts,
think we did much, frankly. What could you do? We used to have discussions, but you know, any of you could have been on part of them.
So you're involved in the Communist Party in Canada, and you said...
Well, I wasn't involved. I only knew two people who were communists.
Really?
The two that we worked with. But through their friends, I had a good idea that there were others.
So membership was kept secret from each other?
Oh, yes, no one knew.
Right.
I don't know whether the other two Canadians... I never was introduced to anyone else as a communist all the time I was in Montreal.
Do you think that was part of the appeal of communism, precisely because it was
no,
so secretive?
it wasn't. I don't think it was. It was a dreadful government. It was a fascist government. They padlocked the unions. They wouldn't have... It was a dreadful...
Was this in Quebec?
Duplessis in Quebec. Yes, it was a...
They were quite right.
Vicious. It was vicious fascist government. I can't give you chapter and verse now, but I know there was a padlock law which allowed them to padlock any organisation that was at all left-wing if they wanted. And there was a total ban on trade unions and so on. It was a different kind of atmosphere.
Because Quebec had been friendly with the Vichy government, hadn't it? Duplessis was supporting the right-wing French government.
Yes. I don't know whether it was Duplessis.
That was before you got there, wasn't it?
Yes.
So let's move forward in time a bit to 1956 and the events in Hungary.
Well, we were still in Canada then, of course.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, this. I don't know why, but immediately after Hungary and so on, as happened in Europe, the two we knew, and I gathered that many others left the party. And
in protest against the Soviet invasion of Hungary?
Yes, like the intellectuals did here. Edward Thompson left, a friend of mine, a journalist, left. Lots of people left the Communist Party then, lost the cream, really, intellectual cream of the Communist Party.
Do you remember the events of Hungary being discussed in Montreal?
No, well, this is it, you see. I think if I'd been in Europe, with all the discussion that went on, I would have analysed much more. George and I didn't take it personally, and I've always felt that many people did. People like Stephen Spender over here. They were angry that they'd followed this kind of belief which had let them down. There'd been such an you see, we were living in this atmosphere of anti-Russian feeling, anti-Soviet feeling. And I felt that the CIA, which they obviously had through Voice of America, I felt that they were so much behind what happened in Hungary. And even reading your day-to-day account the other day, it was touch and go, wasn't it? It could have gone the other way, that they reformed the system. Naj and people were ready to reform.
They could have resolved it peacefully,
Could they?
rather
And
than violently.
I'd never realised how easily they could have resolved it. There was one point in that diary you gave of day-to-day events in Hungary. I've often thought it, but George felt as I did. Though George's father, my husband's father, was a founder member of the Communist Party, but he never joined the Communist Party.
George didn't?
No.
No.
Except he was part of me, and he used to come to our meeting. But he...
Did he discuss with you why he didn't want to join?
Not really. Well, if I did, I don't remember. And his thinking was so much like mine. I don't think George was a joiner. He was much more a free thinker. I think you'll agree with me there. And he was he was much more an individualistic. He didn't want to join. I'm a joiner, I think. I'm a groupie.
The other great love of your life, apart from politics, is literature, or one of the great loves of your life, and French literature and other literature. Can you tell us a bit about that aspect of your life?
Well, French politics, you see, did inspire me, because I was in France from the university at the time of what was called the Stavisky affair, and there was a fascist group that were trying to take over the government of France. And there was a certain occasion in the, that square? Oh God, the great square.
Around the Arc de Triomphe?
Yes.
L'Étoile, isn't it?
No. Anyhow, there was a great demonstration in Paris against the so-called fascist menace. Because everywhere in Europe there was this division of right and left. We're going back now to the 30s. And I was staying with a very right-wing royalist family. And there was this scene, it was this great demonstration, and they fired on the crowd, they killed people. And it was a whole plot, a fascist plot to take over the government. But somehow, I don't know, there were troubles and there was shooting. And the arguments I had, I remember there was a young boy in the family. You see, my political awakening came very slowly, but it was helped by France.
By those kind of experiences, yeah.
Yes, as far as the literature, well, I mean, that's on another level, really. But
you were a lover of Sartre's work and de Beauvoir.
Oh,
and
yes,
people.
and
Camus.
the French. Camus, no, not so much, except as a stylist. He wrote beautiful French. But Camus he wasn't the kind of hero someone who's a dedicated communist would love for his philosophy. And you remember the arguments he had with Sartre, and they fell out over their philosophy of life. But I've always admired him as a writer. He was a wonderful writer.
He took a position pro the Hungarian Revolution, Camus, unlike Sartre, I think.
Did he take it? Oh yes, he would. I don't know whether, I think Sartre, I don't know what Sartre was thinking. I lost touch. Yes, I think my literature, I think France politically had a great impact on me. It taught me a lot. It widened my perspective. It made me into an internationalist.
And when you came back from Canada, you used to take the family to France, didn't you, every year?
Yes, we used to do a lot of
holidays.
travelling in France. And then I taught French. I got a teaching job when I got back eventually. And I was teaching French, so I took my students over every year.
And you became an honorary citizen of Dieppe, I believe. Is that right?
Oh yes, but I worked with the peace movement. And I got, in the end, I had arguments because there were many people in the peace movement who didn't want to have anything to do with the French peace movement, because the French peace movement was spearheaded by the Communist Party. So it was the Cold War philosophy entering even into the peace movement. And I struggled because I once went to a commune in France, and I'd seen Faites l'Europe, pas la guerre, make Europe one. Make Europe, not make war. And I got in touch with the French communists and found out what was happening with the peace movement. And then gradually I started links with Dieppe, and we had a most amazing pro-anti-nuclear demonstrations together. And gradually the official peace movement here, mainly CND, realised that we were working. They, you see, didn't. And this is a question you can ask philosophically. We put our strength into wanting to rid our country of nuclear weapons, so-called unilateralism, which was the red herring. The French and all the other, most of the other European countries in Eastern Europe, Hungary, Poland, wanted the United Nations and a peace, and all the countries of the world to come together to declare nuclear weapons should be abolished. And they never understood unilateralism. And I wonder, because that's where the Tories sneered at the peace movement. They want us to give up, and it's our only defence. It was always a deterrent. It deters people. It may deter, but they didn't want anyone else to have it. So there was this argument, and I wonder if we'd gone for the same through the United Nations, well, we wouldn't have had all the arguments about unilateralism and multilateralism. And I think I worked an awful lot in CND because I worked nationally. I worked internationally with CND, going to peace committees in Eastern Europe. Whether if CND had come out for the same approach, I don't know. It was its strength, but it was also a weakness.
So you travelled to Hungary,
and I think only history will tell the tale. This is about whether you work for. It's like Trotsky said,
peace in one
communist
country or
in one country is not possible, and perhaps peace. He said, socialism in one country is not possible. It's got to be a world thing, and perhaps the same thing is peace. Now we're working for a nuclear weapons convention, which is the right thing, because we're trying to get everyone through the United Nations. So things have moved on, and I think that I'm very optimistic, because all the old people who have been so determined about nuclear weapons, all saying they were wrong, Kissinger, McNamara, all these terrible American,
Cold War warriors.
Cold War warriors, thank you.
I don't think Teller's yet said that, though, has he? Edward Teller.
Well, he'll be the last, perhaps.
So you remain optimistic about human nature, do you? Do you think human beings
I
will
remain humanist.
save the world?
I believe in human beings, and that's my philosophy, really. I believe in the strength of people to change their lives, that people have the power once they realise, and it's the job to raise consciousness. Because I've seen people different, but unfortunately it was because of war. But I refuse to say war is the only thing that makes us human, cooperative, loving to each other. I don't think it's got to be war.
Peace can also galvanise people.
Yes, I think the system we live under is competitive. I think it teaches us individualistic habits We think about ourselves. And we're not geared to a society that's cooperative. I think gradually we shall have a more cooperative society economically, like your exchange of
Services, those kind of things.
capabilities.
And how does your piecework tie in with your feminist philosophy?
Oh,
and what's the role of women in the
That's a whole new angle.
Because you were at Greenham.
Must we start on this? I think just very briefly, I think I've been a feminist without realising it all my life, because I saw my mother helping me with my education and getting a good education. I went to a women's college, so I knew how hard had been the fight to get women educated and so on. And I've always felt, I wrote my book, I think, with women in mind, because women have to be empowered to believe in themselves. And I look today, and it's all in my book, on a chapter on women. You look at it, I looked at one of the pictures in the book you brought from Hungary or Slovenia. All men, top establishment,
scientists, all men.
Not one woman. I look at the United Nations, they have these great pictures. Token woman, 2 or 3 of them, and that's all. Mainly African. The African women are beginning to waken up and do things. And I look at the European Union. They're all men in suits. So we haven't got very far. We still haven't got equality of pay. I've been a member of the Forces Society. And I think women, because of, yes, the Greenham women, but the Voice of Women in Canada, I was part of that. Because women nurture in their bodies and they nurture their children, and then they're taken from them. Yesterday there was a Marine killed. Think of his mother, nice Christmas present. She's looked after him for 21 years. So I think we've got a real vested interest, a bigger interest. Let's finish, Thomas. I'm tired.
Okay, just 2 more questions, yeah? I just want to ask, you've never, as far as I know, travelled in the Middle East.
No.
But you had many Jewish friends over your life in Montreal.
No,
what do you think about the prospects for peace in the Middle East and Iraq?
Well, I think
this is a new focus for war in our time.
Well, I think if you can solve it always worries me. We can go to the moon, we can get my son on a screen talking to me from New Zealand, and we can't produce peace. I thought we'd never do it with Ireland. I thought that was a nut you'd never crack. And it was cracked, so I think it could be done with the political will. But how you get it, I don't know. In the end, they'll have to talk. Don't ask me, because I'm not a specialist on these. I just think
that it is possible.
I think it's possible, because I never felt I think the Irish was just as difficult as the Palestinian one, in its way.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, I mean, this is just a question. You had many Jewish friends in Canada and in the Communist Party. When did you first hear about the Holocaust? When did this come into your consciousness? At the end of the war, did people in Britain realise what
it was the first
Auschwitz?
time I realised. It's in my book, if you want the chapter and verse, but I was working in just behind Marble Arch, is it? The top of Regent Street there, it's another, I don't know, it's not the Marble Arch. I was working in the centre of the West End, And the cinema down Regent Street, I've forgotten what it was called. It was an art cinema, and they showed pictures of the Holocaust. And that was the first, certainly, that it had burst on me. And I say in my book, for the first time, I knew evil. And they had all the pictures that had just come out of Germany. And they were so, they were just, well, we've seen so many since. And I think I was one of the very first to teach about the Holocaust in secondary schools, because I devised a course on Europe. And if you're devising a course about Europe today, you've got to look back at what happened in the war and earlier. And I have a book which my husband bought of the Polish camps and the way the Jews were treated. And I brought that out, and I said, you don't need to look at it, but if you want to, you will be horrified. And it was like the one pictures that came out. They were brought out and put in the centre of London, and people went to see them. It was a dreadful shock for me. So I don't know how much I suspect the government knew more than we said. Let's finish. I brought it to an end a minute ago. You can edit it, though.
One more question, then. In spite of the horrors of the Holocaust and, nuclear weapons and so on, you've said you still believe in human nature, you still have an optimistic view. Yeah. And you used, very early on in this interview, you used the word spirituality. You talked about your own childhood, your connection to nature.
Oh, well, yes.
What role can spirituality play in that transformation to peace, do you think?
Well, I think they always said, I remember, who was it? It was Edward Thompson, whom I admired. He had a Wesleyan father who was a minister. People have said, oh, this transformation from believing in religion, that belief, you transfer that to a strong belief in something else. And I think my strong belief that I transferred was in human beings and their ability, if they only knew it, to change society. The Greenham women showed it. They stood up and said no, and they became politicised. Many of those Greenham women are now running radical magazines, won a tour in Parliament. I saw young people here who came to me and said, Eileen, I've been working with you for peace for a long time now. Not enough. I've joined a political party. Oh, said I. And what's that? The Socialist Workers, he said. Well, he'd become politicised. He'd realised, I think it's empowerment. It's like women. Why don't they go in the streets and make their demands? They have done in the past. So I'm a great believer
in applied spirituality, is what I'm hearing.
And I think I find that working for human beings and believing in them, what else is spiritual? I mean, I think this is the only world, the only life we've got. And we've got to make it a good life. And it starts, that's where I'm in harmony, Thomas. It starts with the individual. And once you realise look at all the people working for peace, look at all the people through the ages who've worked for the betterment of mankind. I feel it's been a spiritual quest, just as much as looking for a God or so. But I think there's nothing more important. And it's not being selfish or anything. It's just that I see this life as all we've got, so we've jolly well got to make the best of it and empower other people, try to empower other people to realise their own power.